I do think there's probably a lot of people out there who are like, all this philosophy stuff sounds like super unnecessary. This is like a totally superfluous to my practical life
Yeah.
exercise.
Hmm.
And I just haven't gone down this road yet, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how would you try
Yeah.
to tell somebody like, no, it is worth your time and energy to think about these things.
Yeah, well, so my answer might be surprising because I maybe I'll steer something of a middle course here. So obviously, famous line: Socrates, the unexamined life is the life not worth living, right? And there's a lot of appeal to that to me. At the same time, I'm not a pure-blooded
Right,
Aristotelian.
but
A lot of people seem to think that yeah, you need to like be a philosopher to have the good life, and I don't think that's right. Why? Because I don't think that philosophy itself is the end of life. I think
by
given
all
human
means.
nature, we're not just rational animals. We're rational social animals that depend upon hierarchy, tradition, institution, authority. You can never get away from this. This is who we are. This is how we learn. This is how we operate in the world. But so I want to steer a course where I want to encourage people to ask these deep questions because I think it can set you on the ultimately right path. But I think that there are people who, within a certain structure,
If and I don't know
mm-hmm.
if you can go back in sort of the memory, but before you discovered, Aquinas, and when you were in that more Nietzschean phase, I mean, do you have any recollection of what your attitude was at that time toward family and marriage and the potential to one day be a father? Like, do you think that you had any thoughts at that age or stage of your sort of philosophical
Yeah,
development about
because
your future
you
role in society?
what when I first got married, I was still pretty much in that paradigm. I was having a lot of problems with it, and it
Hmm.
collapsed not too long after I was married to Christine. But to just speak frankly, I was a very self-serving individual at the time. I had many
Hmm.
relationships, prior to marriage, and it was exceedingly narcissistic. It was like sort of what am I getting out of this relationship? If I were to be with anybody long term, again, it was very sort of inwardly focused, not outwardly focused. Very problematic in a lot of respects, right? And the
Yeah.
relationship always took a back seat to many of my other interests at the time, business interests and study
Right.
interests
Right.
and,
Right.
and stuff and stuff like that. It just was not heavily prioritized. That's not to say that I didn't have genuine affection for my wife. I did, but I would not say that I had a very worked out philosophy of what a human relationship of that kind should be at that point. I just had really just been kind of swimming in that liberal current, right?
Yeah.
That I was sort of brought up in. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Do you think that played out that way? Like, is that an idiosyncratic experience? Or do you think that's a very common experience of like once you start to go down like the Nietzschean or even like naturalism or absurdism, does that take you in that direction of like narcissistic and nihilistic, not nihilistic, like almost hedonistic,
Yeah.
I guess even, or some kind? Is that inevitable? Because I guess I would like to hear your reaction to what I've heard
Sure.
as a counter argument that, well, no, like there's a different path. You can go down this philosophical or mental train of thought and turn
Yeah.
toward humanism and say, well, I can still cultivate virtue and be preoccupied with
Right.
human flourishing
Yeah.
without an Aquinas's worldview, because I can have a constructivist mentality of like,
Yeah.
I'm trying to build the future of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where like we're all enlightened, but none of us are religious.
Yeah. Yeah, so that'll take us a little bit deeper into the metaphysics of the matter, but the answer I think is
Yeah.
is is no, no, and obviously not, right? So if you're taking this sort of naturalistic worldview, and you asked if it's inevitable that people get to where I am, I don't think so, but I think it's highly likely if you're consistent and you keep trying to understand that worldview, is what I would say.
Yeah.
So what is a naturalistic worldview? Well, it really sort of is something that is formed by a broad scientism, that whatever we know
Mm-hmm.
about the world and whatever exists is what sort of comes through the best of what science has to offer. So the entities of reality have to be something that's sort of captured by a ideal physics or bears a close similarity to those sorts of things, right? And
Right.
so your epistemology is going to constrain your ontology of the sorts of things that you think are kind of on the scene metaphysically that we should admit to existing and playing an explanatory role in reality,
Yeah.
right? So that has significant consequences, right? So naturalists who I think are consistent with the tradition of naturalism. Now, there's exotic naturalists out there who aren't consistent with that. We can talk about that as well. I would just argue that they're not consistent and they probably shouldn't call themselves naturalists. But people who are consistent with that, right? They are in stark contrast to, I think, everything you need to even talk about something like virtue. Like, what is a virtue? It's a perfection of a human power, which assumes that there's a such thing as a human essence that exists in an extra linguistic, extra conceptual sense, right? That's not constructivism, right? So whatever you mean by virtue from that worldview is just not what most people think about when it comes to virtues, right? So
no, I think that's true, but I think that they might mean. I think the counter would be, well, it's not about essence; it's about a human nature that I conceptualize as an extension of like evolutionary biology or anthropology. Like I can know as almost as a scientist would, as an anthropologist would, I can survey all these natural experiments of how people have ordered society or conducted their lives.
Right.
And I can say, well, societies that do X thrive more than societies that do Y. Therefore, Y is a virtue, and X, X is a vice, you know?
So let's say that now. I mean, what do we mean by thriving? Like they continue to propagate, but why think that that's really good for a human person, right? Again, you're assuming essentialism there, and even to think of it that each of these people you're surveying are human persons shows that there's some characteristic or underlying property they share in common.
Yeah,
a human essence, a universal human essence, right?
Well, then I think the next thing would be, well, I define human flourishing in a utilitarian, like I want to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. I think that's a very common reaction I get in at popular level discussions. Yeah.
So what I would say is you've given us a hypothetical imperative, but not a categorical one, right? Like if this is what you want, then you should do that. But a categorical imperative is do that. Full stop, right? Yeah. So you can give us all the hypothetical imperatives you want, but that doesn't give me any good reason to follow that if I don't want to, right? Because from this whole perspective, it's just something is good because I desire it, not something. It's not the other way, which is a traditional way that I ought to desire what is really good, and what is really good is grounded in a determinate human essence, which the naturalistic worldview has no room for because of its constrained epistemology and ontology. I mean, it was always sort of assumed that whatever else naturalism is, it's sort of the death of essentialism, the death of teleology, all these components that we think, that I believe are fundamentally necessary to make sense of any sort of binding moral landscape, let alone categorical imperatives. So yeah, you can throw out all the hypothetical imperatives you want, but what we want is something with categorical force.
What is your sort of instinct or experience, or how would you suggest engaging with people who hold the positions I just rattled off? Right, I'm a naturalist. I'm a humanist. I'm a utilitarian, and this hypothetical person I've constructed in my mind, who's an amalgamation of a dozen people I've engaged with. They would say, well, I am trying to develop a thriving society where that optimizes for individual freedom and minimizes suffering. And your like Thomist attitudes toward essentialism are an obstacle to people exploring their own, self-determined, value, and decisions about how to organize their own lives. So how do you, is there any way to engage productively with that worldview, or is this a like clash of civilizations of either you're going to be a Thomist or you're going to be a relativist, and the two cannot coexist harmoniously?
I go with L.Gerson, who says that you have to at least be a big tent Platonist, which would have the commitments I've talked about, or philosophy is impossible, right? That if you want the conditions for philosophy, you have to be a big tent Platonist. And he's got a wonderful book called Platonism and Naturalism, where he argues that naturalism makes philosophy impossible. You're really stuck in a sort of catastrophic skepticism if you embrace that. Now, that takes a lot of metaphysical unpacking. I tried to unpack a fair amount pretty quickly after you threw some stuff at me. But I think it is important, right, to not spend time on issues that are like metaphysically way
fair.
downstream.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and these are issues like family and marriage, right? These are metaphysically way downstream,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of times, if we want to get clarity on something's downstream, we have to kind of come back up and say, okay, was there a little error in the beginning, right, that led to a big mistake later on, as Aristotle would say. So in conversation, first I would say, hey, look, I'm with you. I want to build the best society as well. But what is the best society? Well, we think that society is sort of for the flourishing of man, right? But that means that man is a something, right? That there is an essence to man. So I want to see if we agree on that, right? If there is something that makes sense to talk about some sort of realism concerning essences. We can debate of how that's grounded, right? There's many different accounts, right? And if so, I think you're out of naturalism right at that point, right? But to make sense of the entire project that they're even talking about, right, is already assuming, I would argue, a pretty fundamental metaphysical commitment that is just at odds with naturalism. But the truth is, as we all know, many people who just are irreligious or kind of in a culture that is heavily influenced by naturalism are just unaware of the sort of underlying metaphysics of what they're assuming. So I would try to draw that out and see where that sort of conversation leads. But to me, it is trying to get at what is perhaps most fundamental. That if we can try and fix that and set that straight, then maybe we won't disagree as much toward the end. That being said, I don't think Thomism is incompatible with a free society, so I'd want to challenge that as well. But that's a secondary point, right? But also there's this notion of like of volunteer. There's this voluntaristic conception of the good going on too, where again it's like the good is just what I desire, rather than okay, is there something that is good independent of my desires? And what I should desire what is right desire, and right desire is what is in accord with right reason, and right reason is that if it was apprised of all the relevant facts, it would pursue what is really good given those relevant facts, right? And that's the more traditional understanding of it, because there's lots of people out there that desire to form a society that is very totalitarian, very crushing. And I don't think most people want to say that, well, to each their own.
Right.
On that point, right? I don't think the person wants to say, I just want my society to be like this way. I'm cool if they have their totalitarian. And no, they want to say there's something wrong with that one, right? So really,
I want to ask you this, like the same question with two variations. And I think that pointing out that sort of contradiction of like, well, you wouldn't actually accept like your neighboring society being a totalitarian one and be like, oh, that's fine for them. Like, recognition of that kind of contradiction or paradox. I think that line of discussion is very helpful when engaging with people who just haven't thought deeply about it yet. Like they're just sort of passively going with the flow of popular culture and what their peer group or their latest class they took in college, like whatever, they're just kind of like on that wave. And I think those people, many of them, if you have the opportunity to engage with them and say like, hey, let's stop and think about what we're saying, and it just takes a little bit of conversation for them to say, oh, like, yeah, no, I hadn't thought about that. Like that's sort of group A. And then group B is the like, oh no, I've thought about it and I'm a committed humanist. Like I actively consciously reject moral realism, or I reject there is a human nature. I think like everyone is a blank slate at birth, and it's just a matter of us deciding how to program children, and we can have any society that we can think of.
Right.
And so I think there's two different groups, and sometimes
definitely.
I worry that group A kind of gets talked past. I mean, there's a lot of people out there kind of on the fence, and they just need like a persuasive argument of like, here's a positive way to think about it, So I don't know which of those you want to start with, but I almost feel like if you found yourself at a cocktail party with those two people and you standing around in a corner, how would you, like in a Socratic dialogue kind of way, engage with each of them differently?
Yeah, very differently. Let's take the more extreme person first, who's wanting to bite the bullet, right? So there's, maybe they deny moral realism. I hold that if you deny moral realism, you have no reason to also deny epistemic normativity too, right? Norms governing reasons and the oughts we feel are kind of behind reasoning, right? We feel like, hey, premises, certain steps in argument point to a conclusion. There's certain instances where you ought to believe a conclusion, right, under the pain of being, irrational and stuff like that. So there's often this argument that's given. I think it's a very powerful argument. The guy to go for this is Terence Cuneo. I won't detail all of it now, but it's called a companions of guilt argument. And his defense of moral realism is like, look, there's no way to kind of take down moral realism without bringing down, moral normativity without bringing down epistemic normativity, right? And if you do that, then you're
I
just
want
sort
you
of
to
an
know I
epistemic.
haven't read any of these books, but I'm going to go back and read all of these books that you're identifying.
Yeah. So the
So
point
I
is that,
appreciate you giving me the places to do the homework. Yeah.
yeah. So his argument, I think it's right. Many people have issued that argument as well, and of course there's objections, but I think at the end of the day, it's a good argument, right? That unless you're just being completely arbitrary, right, you're going to kind of end up in an epistemic nihilism, and then you're just not going to have. There's no such thing as a good argument then, right, for anything, including anti-realism, right? So this just really brings you back to these sort of the radical types of skeptics and sophists that the ancient Greeks, like Plato, were dealing with, right? And how do you deal with somebody like that? It's really hard. It's really hard, right? Now, fortunately, I don't think it's that big of a problem because most people realize there's something so fundamentally unattractive and absurd about that position that if that's where somebody has to go, then I want nothing to do with it, right? So I think you can appeal to things like self-defeat, right? If you're denying essences and teleology, then I don't think you can make sense of reason, right? It seems like there's such a thing as reason, and reason inherently points towards truth. If that's not the case, then there's just no such thing as being more or less reasonable or good or bad arguments or anything of the sort, right? Including for these skeptical positions. So I think they do wind up in pretty radical self-defeat, where the old saying is where the most you can do is just sit there and wiggle your finger, right, as the Pyrrhonian skeptic might try to do, but at the end of the day, you're wiggling your finger in response to terms you seem to find meaningful, right, that there's knowledge there happening, right? So I think at the end of the day, good philosophy acknowledges what is obvious. Essences are real. Knowledge is real, and the question for epistemology, for example, is not whether we have knowledge, but given that we do have knowledge, what are the conditions for knowledge? What is the range of our knowledge? I think that's what epistemology is ultimately up to. There is a real objective moral landscape. The question is, again, what grounds that, right? And how can we how can we develop a moral theory to help us navigate that moral landscape? That's what I would say. So dealing with the radical skeptics is difficult because they're denying things that are so fundamental that they're not something you argue up to. They're things you argue from, right? So the most you can do there is just try and show that those positions result in incoherence and self-defeat and this or that. Now, of course, people can bite all the bullets they want. No argument in philosophy, I think, is you can't compel somebody to accept a conclusion. I think the job of the philosopher, if they're doing a good job, is just to keep showing how costly a certain position is, right? Okay, you want to maintain this position, here's what you're going to have to give up, right? Here's what you're going to have to try to live with. And if you can drive somebody to a position that is utterly unthinkable and unlivable, even if they refuse to leave it, I still think you've won. I still think you've won, right, at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's an example where having that dialogue is almost, there's a couple different ways to think about that just for one's own purposes, I guess. But it almost strikes me as like, in a sense, that's a pointless argument. Like, you're not going to persuade that person, but it might be worthwhile to have that dialogue. Like you can, put the rock in their shoe, plant the seed, and hope downstream somewhere that grows into something. But it's almost, I think that's more of like why some people have debates rather than dialogues. I'm not having this conversation with you to persuade you. I'm having this conversation with you to persuade all the people watching this, because I want them to recognize, if they're on the fence, I want them to be persuaded by the contradictions or consequences I'm pointing out in your argument. Now, and so this might be a dangerous question.
Ultimately leads. I agree with you. Right. Yeah.
Right. This might be a dangerous question. And so if you just want to pass on it, I won't be offended. But I'm interested, just out of curiosity, what do you think drives people to hold, like to be committed to those seemingly contradictory and untenable positions? What motivates people to bite those bullets? Are they just they're so committed to their prior assumptions philosophically? Do you think it's like no, all of that is just rationalization of some like more emotional motivation? Like, I'm interested to know what you might think drives people.
I think it's to be fair, it's multifactorial, right? If I'm being honest, and no, I'm just speculating at this point, right? One is it could just be a commitment, come hell or high water, to a political paradigm that they just need to get through no matter what. So I think there's just deeply political motivations, right? personal desires.
Right.
This is going to sound uncharitable, but at the end of the day, I think just faculties that aren't properly functioning, right? We know that there can just be defects in faculties, right? And some people just might not see things. And I don't mean that as an insult, but I think that that's a
No, but they just haven't strengthened their mental muscle in a certain area, and it allows them to fall short.
Right, there's just some sort of defect or damage, and I think rationality actually is tied to proper functionalism and stuff like that. So if there's issues, people can just not occasion beliefs that they otherwise should occasion or would occasion if their faculties were functioning properly. I am a religious man. I think sin factors into it, no doubt. It would be irresponsible for me to say otherwise. Concupiscence, right? So I don't think you can necessarily boil it down to any one thing, but also it could be more modest too. For me, when I was sort of in that naturalistic paradigm, I just didn't know that there was much of an alternative. It was like, oh yeah, science rocks. Science has sort of got this, right?
Right. But I wasn't true. Yeah.
But I wasn't so, and of course that was smuggling in, something that was not at all the result of scientific reasoning, which is a particular naturalistic epistemology. But I didn't know that at the time, right?
Right.
Right. But I wasn't so committed to anything up front that by the time I got to what I thought were pretty absurd consequences, that I wasn't willing to kind of go back to the starting point and try and revise, right? So in that sense, I always like to remind myself and others that I wasn't an atheist like a lot of other people are atheists. A lot of other people, and to be clear, while all naturalists are atheists, not all atheists are naturalists. Just so that's on the table, right? So when I was,
say it again. All naturalists are atheists. Not all atheists are naturalists. So I can be an atheist. I deny the existence of God.
Right.
But I still believe that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you might not be a naturalist. You might reject the sort of worldview that is naturalism. Maybe you reject the sort of scientific epistemology for whatever. But for whatever reason, you still don't believe in God as traditionally understood, right?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I think that actually, I think you've hit on something there that resonates with me significantly. I think that people want to be on team science. People want to say, I like science. I'm pro science. Science does good things. I like technology. I like the advancements of knowledge and life that science has provided. And then I think people, without recognizing that they're doing it or realizing that they've made a leap, say, well, because I'm pro-science, I somehow have to be a naturalist or be an empiricist or be an atheist. I am obligated, because people have conflated those ideas in their mind of like, science is good, therefore religion is bad, like, which doesn't follow. But I think that is sort of in the common collective discussion,
Oh yeah, it was a sort of the tradition that I was handed on, right? And of course you're right. It's what we would call a howling non sequitur, what you just trotted out, right? But I didn't realize that till later on. So yeah, I think that could be another motivation, right? Is that this is just sort of the worldview people were handed. We think that science rocks, and this is the direction that science points in, and you don't want to be a science denier, right? So you're gonna
very out of vogue.
Yeah, very out of vogue. So you're going to stick to that, right? I'm just trying to be charitable and survey a range of options. It's a hard question. I don't have a definitive answer on it, but I like to try.
No. I think that was a very circumspect answer. It is a dangerous question. Okay, so let's pivot from our committed, naturalist, humanist, absurdist to you just have like. What in your imagination constitutes your typical young millennial? You're an average 20-something, just going about life trying to figure out how to, make their way in adulthood. If you were engaging them and trying to guide them away from fallacious or dangerous worldviews and toward a healthy attitude toward philosophy, like where would you tell them to start?
Yeah, start by canceling Netflix, that's for sure, right? What guides them is just a lot of propaganda, right? Coming in through so many of the different highly addictive media outlets. I mean, let's just be upfront about that, right?
And what messages or worldviews do you think, if you're regularly consuming Netflix, that's your go-to source of entertainment, like what are the explicit or implicit like philosophical positions that you're being imbued with by consuming Netflix?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely significant amount of liberalism. And I want to be careful about what I mean by that. We can qualify it as we move on. Heavy
Yeah.
amounts of postmodernism, and I think increasing amounts of transhumanism. If I were to give three things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I don't watch that much Netflix myself, but I get an idea of some of the shows and what people are talking about, and I've seen some clips and things. So not an expert on any of the
Sure.
current material, but I know what I grew up with too, man, in the '90s, and like looking back at
Yeah,
some of
right.
that stuff. Yeah, just a lot of and that was sort of what I was baked in. That was sort of not in a way that I was aware of it or I was conscious of it, right? This was just the TV was just on, and these were the shows that were playing. These were the advertisements I saw, right? And it definitely formed me in a way, towards my attitudes of relationship, towards my attitudes, definitely towards sex, right? The attitudes of family, divorce, all those things, they were all there. So, I am a millennial. So, I was
Right.
sort of stewed in the '90s with a lot of that material, and I'm still,
Cheers and Murphy Brown and
well, more like Seinfeld, Friends, Everybody Loves Raymond, all those types of shows, which are in many ways very funny, right? I still go back and watch the occasional Everybody Loves Raymond show, and I guess that's maybe not as bad as some of the other ones. But yeah, that would be. I think it was John Henry Newman who said, right, that when he kind of had his awakening, he realized his entire life was just one gigantic struggle to foist off pretty much the entire liberal tradition that he was stewed in since birth, right? Just one struggle to just try and peel it all back in a way, right? Yeah. So let me motivate it a little bit further. I mean, it's not just, and materialism, not in like the deep metaphysical sense. I mean, I think that's there too, but materialism is like being a consumeristic, right? That's huge in today's culture. It is often impressed upon us, young people, not just millennials, but before them and certainly after them, right? That the good life is having things, having certain things, looking away, looking a certain way, having a particular amount of prestige, all these things, right? And it leads to horrible amounts of vanity and narcissism and pride and also self-depreciation, right? Not seeing your own inherent worth, right? Putting your worth in things where your worth is not actually, that's not where your worth comes from, right? And then, going up and down with it, whether you meet those sort of artificial and I think false standards that are so set out by today's society and especially the media. And we know that this is not, if you want to just look at the empirical side of it, right? I mean, people are killing themselves at alarming rates. There was a study that came out just recently. The title of the study is called Opiates of the Masses, Deaths of Despair and the Decline of American Religion. And the study makes a case that so many of what really one of the fundamental root causes, if not the fundamental root cause of so many of these increased deaths of despair in America, is this lack of religious grounding, of transcendent grounding. And should that surprise anybody? Of course not. Of course not, right? Open your eyes, right? We see what happens when people get into a culture that is obscenely ego comparative, that lacks any sort of deeper ground for intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, meaning, and purpose. People, especially kids, are constantly taught through the mainstream media, television shows, news, that the world is essentially doomed for various reasons, but it's also not worth saving. And then you wonder why they go and kill themselves, right?
Well, but I would think that some people would deny sort of the causal relationship there, because I'm sure someone would say, and maybe the article or the book addressed this, but I'm sure someone would say, well, other countries are just as, if not more, atheistic or like agnostic, or more, there are more nuns, like no religious affiliation, and I don't know, I'm guessing, Denmark or something.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But they don't have like the deaths of despair that we do. So there must be some other reason.
I have to say I'm not as hip to all the empirical research in the other countries. Just that this recent article by three different scholars I found very interesting, unsurprising. So someone would have to go through and compare the empirical data elsewhere. I don't have that, and I'm not going to try and make
Yeah.
it up. So I would just say that's an open
That's
conversation,
fair.
right? Hmm.
Well, honestly, this is one of the struggles I'm constantly having, and it is a
Yeah,
point of frustration for me. So I don't want to induce this in you, but I know that when I
yeah,
engage with, sort of the science-minded, the empiricists, and so on, there you constantly get this sort of like, well, where's your data for that? Like, where's your evidence to support this conclusion you're drawing about the relationship
yeah.
between like this societal phenomenon and these outcomes? Like, do you have any data to support that? And I'm like, I shouldn't have to have a study to prove every single thing. I think, like, if there's data to contradict it, I would not ignore that, but it's also can't be like, well, let's wait 2 generations of continuing this experiment and collecting data before we
Yeah,
say,
I hope we
yeah,
don't
maybe
need,
this whole like
peer-reviewed
single.
research for everything, because there's no peer-reviewed,
Right.
research article on the fact that Pat Flynn exists. So hope I don't have to wait for that to come in.
Right. Well, or I mean, I don't know. One of my pet sort of working hypotheses, and that might be, I'm giving myself more credit by calling it hypothesis than it deserves, but I've spent a lot of time looking at some of the trends and the data and about like how the adoption of no fault divorce in America
Right. Hmm.
reshaped the landscape of like when people get married, whether or not they get married, whether or not they stay together, and like the outcomes for marriages and children
Oh,
in a
sure.
world where like you can get divorced for literally no reason at all. You just have to choose, yep, I don't want to be in this marriage anymore,
Yeah.
and you don't have to give anybody a reason. How that change, and again, like you get this, I get this kickback of like, well, I don't think you can draw that like these connections unless you like do double blind studies and multiple, and like really this is just a way of saying I don't want to acknowledge what you're saying
Yeah,
because I can.
exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's not
Well,
only is there this demand for the data on things that really are just obvious, and like, look, I think that there
yeah.
are many good open arguments, and we should try and look at the data. And some things are just like, look, we know human nature, we know what perverse incentives do. It's not. This isn't. This is.
I don't have to
Come on, guys, right?
re-demonstrate it every time we have a
At some point, it's
conversation.
just like
Yeah.
it's a come on, guys. But it's worse than that, because we actually do have a lot of data as well. And then when you give the data, then they don't like it and they reject it, right? So, now that's fine. You can give arguments against various studies and their validity, but we have
Yeah.
lots of data, especially between the correlation between religion and spirituality broadly, and all sorts of health outcomes. All sorts of health
Yeah.
outcomes. Now, and like that's very strongly established, right? Now, some people are like, well, it's correlation, not causation. Maybe just
Yeah.
but no, there's actually good evidence to think that it is causal as well. And yeah, I'll throw in my n=1, right? I think my health improved across the board when I became,
Yeah.
religious, and like, because it really does give you a sort of anchoring and meaning and hope. Now, somebody
Right.
can argue that that's all just some total, fiction that you've made up, Pat. Regardless, that's not the point I'm
Yep.
making right now. It gives you that
Right. Right.
anchoring,
Right.
meaning,
Right.
and hope, right? That helps you to avoid a despair that I really felt in the naturalistic
Yep.
paradigm, right? Now, I think, and
Yep.
nobody is completely transparent even to themselves. I think that if I thought the naturalistic paradigm was true, I would have kept it, even if it caused me to despair, because I really do
Yeah.
value truth. That being said, I just don't think it's
Yeah.
true. And given that it's false and
Right.
and leads to feelings of despair, all the more reason to get rid of it. Right.
Yeah. Two good reasons. Two good reasons to
Right.
reject it. So yeah. So let's bring this back to. I think one of the key points that I want to focus back on is for the sort of neutral, passive, person who is maybe, starting to recognize like, I'm not so sure I'm thinking about this right. Or, I have a clear, coherent philosophy or worldview or vision for my life. Like, but I haven't yet made any commitments to any particular philosophical priors. It sounds like one thing we're agreeing on is in our culture today, because like Neil deGrasse Tyson has made science very hip, and people want to
Yeah.
be pro science. What's the like entry level way to engage with somebody to help them recognize that it's what did you say, a howling non sequitur of like, hey man, like you can be all for NASA all day long, and that does
Right.
not force you into a naturalistic or empiricist set of assumptions. Like,
Yeah.
how would you approach that with just a
Yeah.
regular
Well,
25-year-old you meet at a party?
oh wow, are we at Buffalo Wild Wings? Set the scene for me here. So
Yeah, I
I would,
should come up with a
yeah,
good scenario. Yeah.
yeah. I like my chicken wings, so that would be fun. So I would say, look, it's what you might think is incompatible on the surface is actually deeply compatible, underneath, and I would say it's required, right? So the scientific worldview, right, seems to be trying to study the essences of things, and it's required, I would say, the sort of background metaphysics to make sense of why science rocks, right, is because there
Yeah.
are real determinate essences of things that engage in expressions of regular powers that can be captured in equational relationships and the language of mathematics, and that's
Right.
just a sort of worldview where we would expect science to be successful. And without that worldview, it seems like the success of science is a miracle, right? This is one of those sort of no miracles arguments. If you don't think that the success of science is a miracle, then you should be a big tent Platonist, right? Because this is the sort
Right.
of background metaphysics that makes the scientific project intelligible, and gives a real grounding to it. Now, I'll go further and say that it is important that science is not scientism. Scientism is an
Yeah.
epistemology. It's a theory about knowledge, where science is, the practice of
Right.
the sort of arc, right? You form a hypothesis, you collect
Yep.
data, you get your
Yep.
theory, and then you reason deductively down with the making and testing of predictions and stuff like that, right? Scientism is a philosophical position. It's a philosophical add-on.
Yeah.
It's not science. It's not science, something that science could ever even give us, right? And the problem with
Yeah.
scientism is that it seems to be either trivial or self-defeating, right? It's self-defeating in as much as if you're claiming that everything that we know must come through the hypothetico-deductive method, that claim itself is not something that could ever possibly come through that method, right? So it sort of fails its own test. If scientism is true, it's not something we
Right.
could ever know is true, according
Right.
to itself. So that's a problem. Or somebody might push back and say, well, I think of science a bit more expansive than that. For me, philosophy is science as well. Then I'd be like, well, then that's trivial. Then we don't have a substantial disagreement necessarily, right? Theology was often considered the queen of the sciences, and I agree, right? in the expanded sense. So
Right.
we have to separate science from scientism for the 25-year-old, and they often conflate the two.
That's
They
critical.
don't
Yeah.
understand that there's a difference there, and also that science properly understood, especially a lot of the hard sciences, the proper epistemology to take is something like, I would say, a sort of epistemic structural realism, and the way to explain that is that science is very good at capturing some parts of reality, but that doesn't mean it captures all of reality, right? So an analogy that's
Yeah.
sometimes used is like, think of it as like a metal detector, really good at grabbing metal, but just because it doesn't tell you about plastic doesn't mean that plastic isn't there. So really powerful.
I love it.
We can affirm the sciences, very successful, but we shouldn't think that everything sort of comes down to what science can tell us, or if
Right.
science can't tell us about something, then that something is meaningless or doesn't exist. That's the non sequitur,
or,
right?
or not worth knowing, or like, well, I think that maybe they'd take it they downgrade from there and say it's not that we can't know it, maybe we hypothetically could know it, but as a practical matter, as a way to organize your life and society, because we can't establish a definitive, scientifically demonstrable, we can't do an experiment to arrive at some conclusion. Therefore, and I think that there'd be some variation on humility or civility or pluralism or individualism. Some combination of those values compel us to sort of reserve judgment on things that we can't demonstrate scientifically,
Sure.
even if I hypothetically agree that those things could be out there. As a matter
Right.
of how
Yeah.
to organize society, we should all be afraid to arrive at conclusions, much less assert those conclusions, because we can't be certain that we're correct.
Right, and what about science justifies that attitude is what I would say, right? All those value statements, all those odds, are nothing that science gives us, right? So already this person
Right,
seems
no.
to be committed to something pretty
Yeah.
fundamentally inconsistent with what they're pushing, right? But furthermore,
Well, his
there's a
big
lot there
brother's
I wouldn't
a
disagree.
humanist, I think.
Right, but there's a lot of things there I wouldn't disagree with. First off, I don't think I think science is really powerful. I think it can tell us a lot of important things, and we should take them very seriously, and we should take them seriously in relation to what else we can know about the human person and the good life. For example, a healthy diet, right? I think the healthy diet plays into a human good life. There's a lot that science has to tell us there about what a healthy diet is, and we should take that seriously, and that will factor into. So it's not like completely separate categories either, right? There's significant complementarity here. I also agree that we should be humble. We shouldn't rush to conclusions. We should think carefully about things. Absolutely, we should, try to establish things with as much rigor as possible. But none of that demands a commitment to scientism. Right, that's just trying to be epistemically humble and stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You talked about, and I'm sorry I didn't write it down fast enough, but like the meeting of Platonism and naturalism, and like that you said there's already a book out there that talks specifically about that makes the case that naturalism can't serve as a foundation for your philosophy the way Platonism can. Did I get that?
That naturalism is incompatible with philosophy, in fact. And the author of that book is L.Gerson, not a religious guy, from what I understand. Obviously, he's committed to Platonism. He's rigorously defending it, right? And by Platonism, he means a big tent Platonism. So let me explain that before people misunderstand what I'm saying. And it would be fair to misunderstand it because I haven't explained what I mean by that. So when Gerson talks about Platonism, he says it is the paradigm that is sort of everything that modern, largely naturalistic philosophy is not, right? What is naturalistic philosophy? Well, it's nominalist, it's skeptical, it's relativist, it's scientism, it's reductivistic, it's materialistic. Those are the big ones. I'm probably forgetting one or two. But anyways, he trots those out, the sort of characteristics of modern philosophy. So he's like, by big tent Platonism, I mean the philosophy that is anti all those things. Anti-materialistic, anti-mechanistic. That's another one I forgot. A mechanistic sort of worldview. So anti-materialistic, anti-mechanistic, anti-skeptical, anti-relativistic, anti-nominalistic, anti-reductivist, and so on and so forth. So he would say anybody who falls in, who accepts those antis is a Platonist. So he would call Aristotle a Platonist. And a lot of people think that Aristotle and Plato are opposed, but no, not for Gerson. He's like they're way closer to each other than say many modern philosophers are to either of them, right? So and same thing. Aquinas would, they disagree about how they ground their how they ground universals and stuff like that, but they are committed to there being universals and stuff like that, right? So that's the kind of key point. And so Gerson he just wants to say that if you're not in Big Tent, he also wants to say these things are sort of a package deal, right? That you can't, you can't sort of like be a nominalist but avoid the skeptical consequences and stuff like that, right? And I think he's right about that. So his whole position is like, look, you need these antis to make philosophy coherent, right? For philosophy even to be intelligible at all, right? Take nominalism. Nominalism is the idea that there's really no conceptual space for sameness that isn't identity, right? So it would deny that there are universals or universal essences or universal characteristics of anything, right? Everything is just this sort of particular individual, and that's it. Well, that has some pretty radical consequences.
Clustered together.
It's even more radical than that, because you might think, okay, well, maybe there's an essence of what it is to be an atom, right? Maybe all the other essences are constructed, but maybe there's essences on the bottom level. Nominalists deny that there's any conceptual space for sameness that is not identity, right? So this would seem to make not just, there's a lot of consequences to this worldview, right? If there really is no human essence, then how do we ground human equality, which most of us are committed to, right? Because like if you're just looking at our physical characteristics, we're all very, very different, right? I'm sorry to say, but it's true. Also, going further, however, it would seem to make meaningful communication impossible. Like it just doesn't seem like if we're both talking about justice, we could be talking about the same thing, right? That my concept of justice would ever in any way be your concept of justice. It doesn't. Yeah. Right. It doesn't. But it's even worse than that, because it seems like thinking is just communication within ourselves. So it doesn't even seem like I could have this step in the same river of thought twice if nominalism is true. But then how can I
Yeah,
ever
right.
reason to any positions, right? So again, you kind of, so that's just a teaser.
We've just
Sorts of
sunk down
things.
deep into nihilism. Like there is
Right.
nothing
Exactly. We're
is
wiggling the
reliably.
finger
Yeah,
again. And that's just the
yeah,
teaser of the sorts of thing Gerson's is up to, is showing like this is why these things are a package deal, right? So it's very arbitrary to say
right.
be anomalous, but then try to like evade so many of the skeptical consequences downstream. So ultimately,
Yeah,
and of course, there's many philosophers, many naturalists who are very open about saying like, look, naturalism is wedded to nominalism, right? There's many out there, so this isn't just like the non-naturalists like trying to say that the naturalists are nominalists. It's something that naturalists themselves often champion, right? And of course, let me be fair, there's attempts of naturalists and nominalists to try and get around these issues. I just don't think any of them are ultimately successful or even close to successful. But people will have to investigate
yeah.
that for themselves. But the point is for Gerson, like, look, if you think reality actually is intelligible at the end of the day, if you think that these consequences are unlivable and definitely false, then you just need to be a big tent Platonist. And you shouldn't, the other theme of his book that I really liked is you shouldn't try to make compromises with the naturalistic worldview. He sees so much of the failures
Huh.
and confusions of modern philosophy as people trying to make compromises between these two worldviews and never succeeding in getting those compromises
Really?
to stick. So it's actually a phenomenal book, Platonism and Naturalism, for people who are interested. For me, it might have been it's just such an incredible book for people who are interested in these like deeper or higher up meta level issues.
So actually, I want to go to one level deeper on in a particular area, but first, I suspect you're aware of Steven Pinker.
Yeah, I
You're
am. I
aware of
haven't
this
read too
name?
much of his work. I've read a few of his books.
So
One
the
book
only book of his I've read is called Enlightenment Now. Now I understand that the book that was like his first big book was called Our Better Angels, and Enlightenment Now is, I haven't read that one, but I understand it's just sort of building upon, it's expanding on the same theme, which is that he's almost making like a consequentialist case for the Enlightenment thinking, the Enlightenment
right.
ideas
I'm
of
familiar with his general
science.
thesis, but I have not read the book. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So just for the sake of trying to give it in a nutshell here for you to react to, I think he would argue, for all of the detractors of modern society, I can give you 100 reasons why life is better today than it was 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years. You pick any time, and I'll tell you we're better off today than we were then, and I will tell you the reason for that is because of the influence of the Enlightenment. And so, if you're trying to, if you're espousing any philosophical worldview that's contrary to science and humanism and individualism, then you're essentially trying to undo all the good that we've accomplished,
Yeah.
since we broke free of the Dark Ages and Christendom. And I'd like to
Sure.
know how
Yeah.
you at a cocktail party would explain to a 25-year-old who read that book. Yeah, here's why Pinker. Here's where Pinker's going wrong here.
Yeah. So first off, I'm not like totally anti-enlightenment type of guy by any means. I think it's a
Yeah, yeah.
complicated story like anything else, and I think there is a lot of good that has come out from the Enlightenment. But I also think that there's obviously a lot of bad. I mean, in terms of like mega murderers, pretty much all post-Enlightenment, Soviet Gulag state, communist China, Nazi genocide state, depraved nationalist regimes, right? Show me a pile of bodies that big prior to Enlightenment ideology. You won't find
I mean,
one.
they'll
Now,
say
maybe
they'll
it's
say
just
the Crusades. They'll say
not even close. This is laughable. Not even close. Now, maybe it was just technological limitation. Okay, but I would argue no. There's other deeper issues there, right? But I'm willing to bet.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to be corrected on this. That among the pile of bodies that Pinker is not counting in his book are aborted children. Does he count them?
Yeah,
If not, then
100%
he's
correct.
then he's begging the question. Against somebody like me would say this is a horrible atrocity that's happened because
Right.
we've lost the fundamental sense of what the human person is and human dignity. And it's even worse because we're so blind to it that you wouldn't even think to consider it. Man, that's pretty darn awful. So I don't know if that
Yeah.
refutes his case, but those are at least some chips I'd put on the table as saying, well, maybe let's not be too quick here. We can acknowledge there has been a lot of good, but there has been some horrendous. I mean, the most horrendous evil that we have seen, right? When that we know about in human history, that I don't even need to
Sure.
rehearse now because everyone are deeply familiar with it. Again, when did those come on the scene, right? And what sort of ideologies were they
Yeah.
wrapped up with? Wasn't ideologies, that affirm the the intrinsic and valuable dignity of every human person, stuff like that. Now you can point to instances within certainly the Christian and Catholic and even Protestant traditions where people lived inconsistently with that, and often horribly so. Granted,
Right.
but at least they
Right.
had the principles for their own correction
Right.
and rebuke, right? Whereas so many of these,
Right. Yeah, those
other
bad outcomes weren't because of their principles. It was because they failed to live out their principles.
right, whereas other ones they just have these horrible controlling or operating principles to begin with, and what you got was, I would argue, not totally unexpected, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now going back to that's actually a really good segue. So in a worldview where we believe we can say things about human essence and human nature, and we can affirm the dignity of the human individual that's consistent with our philosophical, we're not just arbitrarily plucking that out of nothing and trying to
Right.
cram it
Mm-hmm.
into our empiricism, but we're saying how, like, where would you start and how far do you think we can go in the course of a long lunch at Buffalo Wild Wings to explain to somebody, well, here's how you can, here's your foray into Platonist thinking about the human essence and how we can think about human nature and human flourishing. How you would talk about it to somebody over a pitcher of beer. Yeah, how you would approach
Yeah.
like having that dialogue over a pitcher of beer or two.
Well, I think I would hope it would go in a lot of the ways that we've talked about here.
Yeah.
I would try to tailor it, of course, to where they're at. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to
Yeah.
talk about nominalism if nobody's ever heard of that before or something like that. But for you, and I'm sure a lot of your audience, that idea will be pretty familiar. I mean, it doesn't hurt to appeal to people's moral intuitions ever, right? And as much as people like to talk about the relativism in our culture, it is a real thing. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
people really are moral realists, right? Even the strong form relativists think that like we ought not to impose our values in other countries or societies, right? That seems like they're actually committed to a universal prohibition there and stuff like that. That you shouldn't own other people as property. That racism really is bad. It's not just distasteful according to me and stuff like that, right?
Right.
And I think there's nothing wrong with acknowledging those intuitions, acknowledging that many of them are good and right intuitions, and then trying to have a conversation about, well, what sort of worldview will shore that up. And the truth is a lot of people have a lot of core commitments that are just kind of floating in air. They're suspended because they haven't
Yeah.
examined them, and they haven't seen, well, what supports these commitments. Are they supportable? And if somebody is really committed to something, right, say a moral position or a political position, they might be willing to revise or even adopt something underneath if it gives them reason to support that position, right? So then that's when you can kind of explore the options underneath, as we've done here. And I think there's a clear paradigm that helps to make sense of not just moral facts, but also moral knowledge, how we can really come to know certain moral truths, right? And there is another paradigm that should, I think, force us to be anti-realists, to think that our moral beliefs are all ultimately false and some sort of, something that was sort of programmed in us through the blind forces of evolution just to avoid bears and have sex and get to Buffalo Wild Wings occasionally, right? And most people are pretty committed in their moral positions and convictions. They probably don't want to accept that, and if they do, then we can just start chasing down that trail of, I think, skepticism to see where it leads. Mm-hmm. But the point is, appealing to people's moral positions, I think, is a good entry point for conversations like these. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. I love that. Now, I like, though, you alluded to a lot of people just have these like floating assumptions or, premises that they haven't anchored to anything. They're not grounded in like a coherent set or, a paradigm. Now, so my so my wife actually, so she and I had in one of our recent episodes, like we kind of had this meta discussion about like season 2. I'm in season 2 right now, and season 1 didn't have any of this kind of discussion. It was just us like, hey, I did a lot better job keeping up with the laundry this week than last week. Like it was just very, day to day, practical, like day in the life kind of stuff. And she was saying, she was like, if I hadn't married, I'm trying to remember exactly how she put it, but she said, if I hadn't married you, I would have gone my whole life just thinking whatever I thought and never wondering why I thought it. And I would have had a perfectly good life. Like you're putting all of this, you're creating this, psychological and emotional burden to like understand why I think these things and whether or not those things are sound. And she's like, and I probably, I am more introspective and I have revised like some of the ways I think about things. But I think a lot of people out there just go about their lives without ever dealing with any of that. And they live perfectly fulfilling lives. And in the moment I said, well, I think we'd have to discuss whether or not that is a fulfilling life if you haven't.
Well, exactly right.
Like,
Yeah.
but I mean, like that was as far as we got in the moment, but I've been thinking a lot about that since she made that comment. I do think there's probably a lot of people out there who are like, all this philosophy stuff sounds like super unnecessary. This is like a totally superfluous to my practical life exercise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I haven't gone down this road yet, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how would you try to tell somebody like, no, it is worth your time and energy to think about these things.
Yeah, well, so my answer might be surprising because I maybe I'll steer something of a middle course here. So, obviously, famous line, Socrates, the unexamined life is the life not worth living, right? And there's a lot of appeal to that to me. At the same time, I'm not a pure-blooded Aristotelian. A lot of people seem to think that, yeah, you need to like be a philosopher to have the good life. And I don't think that's right. Why? Because I don't think that philosophy itself is the end of life. I think, or the end of, for humans, I think it's union with God. So I actually think the religious life is more important than the philosophical life at the end of the day. Now, philosophy helped get me there. But I look, at the end of the day, I think the woman, that I see at church praying her rosary in the pew, who has no idea what nominalism is, right? She's doing it right. she's got it right. Now, would it be better? Would it be better if she maybe thought about these things occasionally? Perhaps. But so I want to steer a course where I want to encourage people to ask these deep questions because I think it can set you on the ultimately right path. But I think that there are people who, within a certain structure that is already there, and this is sort of one of the things that I really came to see about the Catholic Church that really struck me about the Catholic Church, if I can be an apologist for that for a minute, right, is that, like, given human nature, we're not just rational animals. We're rational social animals that depend upon hierarchy, tradition, institution, authority. You can never get away from this. This is who we are. This is how we learn. This is how we operate in the world. So it actually just sort of struck me like, hey, if God is going to reveal something and that something is important, it seems like it would probably be bound up in those sorts of things because God works with things. This is a guiding Thomistic principle according to their nature. And we're beings that, live and move and learn and operate and flourish according to tradition, institution, hierarchy, authority. And then suddenly the structure of the Catholic Church is making a lot of sense. And the structures the Catholic Church puts in place. Structures and rituals themselves.
Right.
So important, right? To kind of be the guides for us to help what? Cultivate what is necessary for the really good life, at least from the religious and theological perspective, which are the theological and natural virtues, right? That doesn't mean that you have to read Gerson's book and try and work out all the problems with nominalism by any means, right? That you could, just by participating in a certain structure, live a very good life without being a technical philosopher by any means. So I'm trying to give and take a little bit on that.
No, I appreciate that, and actually, I love
think
that.
Is true about it. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Okay, so now there's two. You've answered my question for two people, but I can think of a third, maybe a fourth. One person we've sort of charted a path for, created an archetype for, is the like motivated, philosophically thinking, like seeker of truth, and like how that person can find their way, or be like invited to find their way through all these issues you've explored, and as you've mentioned, like starting with appealing to people's like moral intuitions and their innate like moral realism and building out from there. or any of the paths that you discussed in your own life story. So that gets you, the person who's motivated to actually explore, like look under the hood and try and make sure, like, hey, do I understand how all this stuff works? You can take them down that path of teaching that to them. Now, the second person you just addressed is, well, the person who is willing to embrace tradition and received wisdom and guidance from like their culture and society and structures around them, like that, for example, that is provided by the Catholic Church. That person can also live a perfectly fulfilling, well-balanced life that is coherent with or like consistent with their human nature and what makes for a well-functioning society. That hangs together well. But what about the person whose disposition is neither of those? I'm neither really like doing the work myself. I'm not like reading Gerson, nor am I willing to just accept on faith or accept as a matter of authority and tradition. This is an appropriate way to live one's life because this is the wisdom and tradition I've received from, my parents and my community. The third person, the skeptic, the individualist, who's starting from that worldview of, for whatever reason, that they're coming to the conversation at Buffalo Wild Wings. They're coming to the conversation, and the only thing that they're sure of is, really, I should be determining. How do I want to say that? It's up to me to determine what is good and how to structure my life. And the first step is to be skeptical of other people's views and society and tradition, because that I didn't invent that, and I don't want it to be imposed on me.
And they didn't invent skepticism either. That's a nice tradition that I'm sure they inherited from somebody at some point, right? So. The point is like,
but there they are. They have it,
right? Yeah, this is a common theme, right? That a lot of times people don't realize that they're objecting to something that they themselves actually hold, right? And if you reject as legitimate means for being justified in position altogether testimony and tradition and authority, I mean, you're just going to be in an epistemological catastrophe, right? I mean, so much of what we know.
Walk me through why that's true.
Well, I only know my name and where I was born because of testimony and tradition, right? My age. There's so many basic things, right? So much of science. Who's run all that stuff themselves, right? So much of science is based on testimony and tradition, right? And authority. Trust the experts, right? And I actually think that generally, unless there's some override or reason to be skeptical of them, that should be the default position, right? Now, if you hold what I do, which is a certain paradigm, I think Catholicism is true. I think that there is a such thing as human nature, and it has a particular end, and that there is that rationality and rational belief is something that's sort of delivered to us via, or occasioned in us via properly functioning faculties that actually have truth as an end, and they're operating in their sort of environment that they're supposed to be operating in, and so on and so forth, and the other conditions following like a Planiga account, right? Then it's going to be very reasonable to accept tradition and authority in a lot of circumstances, especially if it links to what's true, right? So we might say that knowledge is believing something because it's true, and then it's rational if certain conditions are met. So this might seem like a little trick, but I actually think it's right. Like, if Catholicism is true, you will be justified in believing it just by being in that tradition, right? Just by being in that tradition on this account of rationality. You don't have to know that you know it. That's the neat thing about, I think, how I think about this epistemologically. So you wouldn't have to do any of the fancy philosophy you're doing. You just, call it, by happenstance. I think providence is a better word, right? You would be totally justified just by being in that tradition and believing it, because it is reasonable to rely on that testimony, especially if I'm making this conditional, if it's actually true, right? If this was revealed and the authority of the church is what the church says, then you would be highly rational and justified to believe in that, even if you don't. You sort of made everything explicit, if you will, right? So I would say those couple of things. One is that you can't, unless you want to be in a total epistemological catastrophe, you have to make room for tradition and testimony and authority, including the venerable tradition of skepticism, right? Or those who are handed on Descartes' tradition of like starting from ground zero all by themselves. It's all traditions, right? And then, yeah, to me, it's like skepticism just demands a reason, right? We should have some reason to be skeptical in particular instances, of course, especially if we're getting like increasingly or radically skeptical, let alone cynical or something like that. Now, there is another person that I don't know if this is the person you're thinking of, but it's sort of the indifferent person. And I think in many ways they're the hardest person to deal with. It's one thing to deal with somebody who's really
That's the fourth person.
who's really interested in these things and they just disagree with you. But we kind of have something in common that we do care about these big questions, and we do seem to care about getting to the truth. And you can have a spirited discussion, and oftentimes it's fruitful. But what about that person who just loves their Netflix and their sports ball, and like you just can't even get them to think or talk about these things? Yeah, that's
sports ball
tough, and I think that's a result of many different things, many of the factors that we considered before, and
right.
I think the most you can do there is try to plant seeds, but I also think without branching, we can make this another discussion another time because it would take us far afield. But I think that actually providence and the problem of evil has an important role to play in all this, right? Whatever else
with indifference,
whatever else you want to say about suffering, indifferent people tend to stop being so indifferent when they're going through intense periods of suffering, and things that may have seemed not so important
I'm picking
before
up what you're putting down now.
Suddenly become really important. Questions that you didn't think to ask before, you suddenly start asking, and things you thought were important before seem to rank far lower in terms of priority, right? But that's God's job. That's not my job, is all I'll say about that, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. That is a worthwhile, and that would be a long-form discussion. But no, well, so one thing, maybe a step shy of that, though.
Yeah.
So many things that could be an entire deep dive. But given that we've kind of identified, all right, you can have the philosophically motivated truth seeker. You have the person willing to receive tradition. Like, I don't want to do the work, but I'm happy to. I'm going to take it on testimony. I'm going to take it on faith. I'm going to take it on. I just think it's rational for like, yep, this all hangs together. It's what I received, and I have no reason to doubt it. So that person's taken care of. Now, we talked a little bit about the individualist and the skeptic, and so that's good. Now, the fourth one, you just said indifference. So we've covered 4 scenarios. Now, given that those are sort of 4 attitudes that people can take as they arrive to this conversation, so it's like, this is becoming like a hanging metaphor of like pints with Aquinas, like a pitcher of beer with Pat Flynn. Like, so there's 4 different people who can come have a pitcher of beer at Buffalo Wild Wings. Let's rewind the clock. Like, as a parent, how do you engage with your children and introduce concepts, philosophical concepts, religious concepts, epistemological concepts, to either guide them toward a healthy paradigm or inoculate them against being like drawn in by one of these competing traditions of skepticism or indifferentism?
Yeah, well, so for people who don't know, married with 5 children to my beautiful wife Christine, and she's an interesting example because she was never baptized. She was spiritual but not religious for a lot of her life, and then she became an atheist when she sort of met me, and I kind of dragged her into that paradigm, and then I left before she did. But one of the things that moved her, and this is relevant to the conversation, Marcus, is that she had a core commitment, especially when she had kids. What was that core commitment? That the love she felt for her children was not explicable according to a particular reductionistic, materialistic paradigm. This love that she felt for her children that she never felt before was a core commitment that was enough that made her want to shift things underneath, if that makes sense, to make sense of that commitment. So that's, again, I didn't argue my wife into, that's not always the best thing to try to do, is try to argue in certain positions. Best thing to do, by the way, is to try and be a good example. And that's how I'll start to answer your question. The first thing that we care about for our kids is that they see how much love there is between husband and wife, and of course our faith as well. So I was just at Mass this morning with one of my daughters. The rest are going tonight with my wife. The reason we're going separate is I'm in a band. I'm in a band, Marcus. So I got band practice tonight. So, but usually we're almost always at mass at mass together. At least once a week for
Yeah.
Sunday, if not more. And we homeschool straight up. I know that's not gonna be like something that everybody
Yeah.
can immediately hop into, but it's something we discerned for a while and finally made the leap on. Especially when we moved to Wisconsin, just things sort of lined up that when we moved from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin, we're like, all right, let's just give this a shot, and it's been brilliant.
Now, what's the age range of your children?
So oldest is Roan. He's 9, and then goes down by twos. The rest, Roan's a boy, rest are girls. So it goes Roan, Mira, Isla, Marin, Briga. Yep. So we got our nice little troop there.
I'm only up to 3 so far. Girl, boy, 6, 4, and 2. So.
Oh, God bless you. Yeah. It's really is just fundamentally world changing when you have kids. It really is. I know everyone tells you that. I was told that before I had kids, but it's just, and then you look back and you're like, oh yeah, they were right, but I totally didn't understand what they were saying.
Right, but then you have that commitment, like you say. Yeah. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you bear real obligations to these kids, right? You not only need to provide for their nourishment, but their education and their moral development, and we take that very seriously. And we thought that would be best done with homeschooling. So I work for myself. My wife is stay at home. She homeschools. There's amazing homeschool communities. So part of that homeschool is a quite robust religious catechesis and curriculum. Also lots of good. It's classical education, so they're getting lots of philosophy, good sources, real traditional classical trivium type based education, which I think is really important, reading the great works and stuff like that. And then, environment matters, right? We are around most of the time people who share, the core commitments that we do and try and live their life as best as they can to those core commitments, that live a practicing, devout Catholic life. Of course, none of us are perfect, but we feel that community is really important. Now, at the same time, we're not trying to live in a bubble, because I know my kids have to be prepared to go out into the world, and it's going to be very different. So, it's this moderation of not being a helicopter parent and overly sheltering, but also making sure that they have the formation, the understanding that increasingly they'll be able to engage with the world without being consumed by it. And look, whether or not we're successful, check back with me in 20 years, right? But that's our approach that we're taking right now. Mm-hmm.
Well, I often lament and sort of kick around, and it cuts several different directions. But, I've talked to some people my age with like kids the same age who have strong opinions about the way they parent. And I'm occasionally point out like, well, you don't know how that's going to turn out yet. Like you could be like, well, I'm doing it this way. And like, this is definitely like the way you should approach such and such. I'm like now I'm going to become the scientific skeptic and be like, where's your evidence for that? Like, let me show me the outcomes of this experiment. Well, because I mean, I don't want to go down too many of those sort of like hypothetical or like competing narratives, but your answer is a good answer. It doesn't help me though, because I'm not homeschooling. Sir, if you're not in that scenario, then the question is like, well, what do you do in addition to, Right.
Well, first off, you have the best home life that you can, right? And I think, again, if I'm just going to assume you're trying to come from the same global perspective I am, dad is so important, right? Dad, having a dad that is that is active, that is engaged, seems to make enormous statistical difference in the outcome of a child's life across the board in many different ways, right? Many different ways. So dad's got to be there. And there's plenty of time when the kids aren't in school, right? Where dad needs to be there. He needs to be active. He needs to be engaged with mom. And, at the end of the day, the family unit, if it's there and it's working well and it's doing its functions. I'm not like a totally anti-public school guy. The public schools by us are actually pretty good. They haven't seemed to go completely off the deep end like some of them have, right?
Some of them have.
So I think it's I think it's case by case and instances like that. We were leaning private school first before we decided to homeschool. So again, I think there's a range of options there, but I think that the core thing is having that solid, having dad active, having that extremely solid family unit, and where you take an active role as not just an example, but a teacher in the life of your children, right? And I think that's probably the best you can do at the end of the day. I mean, you can't control everything, right? Things can and will happen no matter what. The best you can do is say, hey, here's what I know, probabilistically will probably give me the outcomes that I think are best for my children. And I think that's it, right? Mm-hmm.
And again, this is sort of like a third ring of the third concentric ring of things we could talk about.
Yeah.
But just as a wrap up, what do you think is possible? Like you talked about, like setting the right example and being engaged and taking on the role of like teaching your children and setting an example in your life. But what about like beyond your family, right? Like, because you have a lot of control over your family life, and you can seek out community with other families who share similar values. But in terms of like the cultural, the societal level discussion, like what do you think is within the realm of possible to like move the trajectory in a more positive, less materialistic, nihilistic, reductionist, direction? What would that look like?
That's a really big question, and it's going to be hard to answer, but I'll do my best. First,
It'll be a great foreshadow for part two. Yeah.
Let me say that political philosophy is probably my weakest area, and that's interesting because it's one of the areas I was first most interested in. I was very liberal, then I was very libertarian. But once you do political philosophy, you quickly realize there's a lot of ethical considerations. That brings you to ethics, and then once you start thinking about ethics, it's hard not to think about metaphysics. And since I got into metaphysics, I sort of never stopped, right? So at some point, I'll have to work back through and straighten out now I've straightened out a lot of my political philosophy because everything's connected, and once you make metaphysical adjustments, very likely that'll cause ethical adjustments, and very likely that'll cause adjustments in your political philosophy. So I don't have a fully
poli-sci pre-law type of guy. So that's actually like that's my like home turf, is where I think about things is through that that lens, and then I have to take myself out of that lens to think more about let's think about societal questions and issues of family and tradition that aren't necessarily political. But then it's I find myself getting pulled back into that sort of political question,
Yeah, so I know I'm not a libertarian anymore. I know at least that much. And Plato's helpful because in the Republic he's trying to answer what the question of justice is, at least for the human person. But he thinks we can kind of figure that out by looking at the large scale, which is the state, right? And he goes through different qualities that the state can go through, from aristocracy to oligarchy, timocracy, oligarchy, and then democracy for Plato is like one step before tyranny and stuff like that, right? Where is America on Plato's scale? At best, it's oligarchy, right? And
it's a grim at best.
A grim at best, it's oligarchy. If not, maybe one of the latter two. And it's important for Plato. He's not in that project, he's not necessarily against the idea of a constitutional republic. For him, democracy is a sort of qualitative state of the state's soul, right? There's a disordering here where reason has been overtaken by the appetites and stuff like that, right? That probably describes America in a lot of ways, right? So what's possible on the large scale? That question hurts my brain. So I always try to think about, well, where should we start first? And that is, of course, what is closest to you and closest to home. So I try to avoid, and we encourage other people to avoid, if you're trying to change the world through Twitter, but you're neglecting your family, something's gone horribly wrong, right? Your obligation is to pursue your happiness, and part of that, if you have a family, is to pursue the good of your happiness. And there are things right in your immediate proximity that bear a stronger moral obligation than you going and fighting political battles on Twitter, even if they might make a difference, right? There is a sort of moral priority and hierarchy. So I think proximity matters when considering moral obligations, definitely. So that's one thing. Then there's a lot you can do locally, not just in your immediate family. That's where you have the biggest effect, but even your local communities as well. I think it is important to get involved in your local communities and local politics and get the sorts of people in charge, because as crazy as the wider world gets, there's a lot you can do locally, to shield and protect and set up structures. So I would like people kind of thinking in that way as much, not to say that the wider perspective doesn't matter, but there's more things you can control the closer you are to home that are going to make an immediate difference. So that's the first thing I would say. Other than that, I mean, our country is obviously deeply divided. I think laws do matter. I'm not a political determinist. I think culture impacts laws. I also think laws impact culture, obviously. I mean, obviously,
Right.
obviously,
Right.
obviously so. So I think if there's opportunities to change laws, even if they don't even if they would be culturally unpopular, but they point in the right moral direction, I think those opportunities should be seized upon. You should campaign for those opportunities, as long as you don't think that there's some sort of imminent horribly worse outcome that would happen from it. I think that is important because again,
Right.
people take moral signals from the laws, right? But laws are also often crafted depending on cultural attitudes. So I think it works both ways. So I resist the idea that
Yeah.
you shouldn't try to push for laws just because they're unpopular or they don't have a chance of succeeding. Many laws have succeeded that were hugely
Right.
unpopular, and then 10 years later, it's just sort of like it's hugely influenced culture downstream. So I think fighting legal battles as far as possible is cultural and legal are both highly important in that respect. So sorry, I threw a lot of stuff out there, and I don't know if any of
Worthwhile.
it
Yeah.
actually answers your
I
question.
love it. No, that's great. I think you probably laid out like the 5-part conversation we'll have in a few months or something. No, I think this is a good place to end. You've given me. I am so grateful how generous you've been with your time, and so we recorded a couple hours, and I will edit it down to like under an hour. I'm happy to give you whatever sort of editorial post-production rights you want. Like, do you want to review it before I publish it or
What?
anything
No,
like
whatever
that?
you
Or
think is this was best. Honestly, this was a total pleasure, and don't feel like you have to edit it down. If you think keeping all of it or more of it in, by all means, whatever you want.
I will probably publish it in both forms. I probably make a long form and short form available. Um,
Hmm.
in any case, I'll circle back with you and let you know what I decide and when things are live and all of that. But for the tape, thank you so much for joining me, Pat Flynn from Philosophy for the People. Where can people find you? Is there anything you'd like to promote? Any upcoming releases or anything like that?
Well, thank you, Marcus. It has been an absolute joy. Yeah, a few things. My podcast and channel, Philosophy for the People. If you just type in Pat Flynn Philosophy for the People, you should find the relevant places on YouTube and iTunes and stuff like that. Two books were submitted this year. I can't say for sure when they will be out, probably spring of next year. One is on Aquinas's De Ente. He's got this beautiful little argument for the existence of God, which me and my friend Dr. Gavin Kerr defend and also say you should use this as a lens to understand his 5 ways in his wider metaphysics. And then another book also on classical theism, where I just usher in a series of different considerations and flavors and versions of cosmological arguments and cosmological reasoning that I find interesting and actually ultimately pretty persuasive. So probably next year. Again, no definitive dates. I've done it on my end, so it's mostly in the publisher's hands right now. So that'd be about it.
Thank you again so much, and I look forward to us circling back to find a time to do a part 2 after I've trotted out some of these books I've explored that you've recommended. So thank you again.
Thank you.